just to kind of note, this is a different title than what was listed in the presentation, just because my colleague who was not able to fill in, I'm sort of filling in for him in this particular topic. So I'm going to talk about some work that has been done prior, and this is published paper. So it's basically looking at a new sulfate resistance test method that we developed in our lab about about 2 years ago. If no one's familiar in this particular room with sulfate attack is essentially, in this case, we're talking about chemical sulfate attack, which sulfates are external to the concrete and ingress and cause deterioration. Typically, this is in the form of expansion, cracking, spalling on the surface. And this could be really, really sort of a severe form of deterioration that could occur depending on the concentration, the type of sulfur that you can get. Most common ones that we typically refer to are sodium, magnesium, calcium sulfate. Specifically because the method that we use to currently test for sulfate is ASTM C1012. So this is a performance method that uses mortar bars in which simply you have a high water cement ratio, about 0.485. You heat cure these samples, and then you simply place them into a 5% sodium sulfate solution. So just to give you an idea, that is about 38,000 ppm of sulfate. So it's very, very high aggressive solution. Normally we can not necessarily uncommon to see these sort of concentrations in the field, but very rare. Normally we're on the orders of about 2,000, maybe 3,000 ppm in sort of a seawater sort of scenario. But the drawback in this test method is, if you notice, it's about 12 months that it takes, particularly for any sort of real sort of data to be collected. So usually we refer to ACI 201, which is the durability specification, to determine whether we have good resistance or not. And it's based on a sort of a 6, 12, or even in some cases 18-month data point that we have to get. So it's a really an issue in terms of just length of time to get significant data. So why bother with sulfate attack, right? And if you maybe talk to colleagues, sulfate attack is not a huge concern. Normally, ASR, corrosion especially, are much of a big concern, shrinkage. But sulfate attack, it doesn't necessarily occur. There's specific locations geographically which particularly this is of a concern. And particularly in Texas, West Texas, and some parts of New Mexico, you do have fairly high deposits of gypsum, which is a calcium sulfate base that we have seen some forms of deterioration. So from TxDOT point of view, we do have some concern with this type of attack. But why do we care? Obviously, we love our concrete, right? So concrete is particularly why we want to even care about this. So, but in the reality, really why we care, right? Well, if you're thinking about a performance cement, and 1012 is the only one that is available. It's a very lengthy one. So, bringing on new types of materials, things like PLCs or edge-to-edge systems or rapid setting cements, blended systems, right? It's particularly difficult to do when you have such a long test wait time before you can actually be able to implement these types of materials, right? So you need to assess performance durability within a reasonable time. Secondly, 1012 has been sort of given a bad reputation of having a large disconnect between lab and field performance. Right. So this, what we're aiming at is developing a method that doesn't necessarily just accelerate, but also gives the ability to maybe do it with concrete, which if you remember, the 1012 method uses a mortar. So it's still quite a bit of a disconnect from what we actually do in the field, right? Which is what we work with is concrete normally. And then obviously performance based specifications are becoming pretty popular nowadays, right? So we want to ideally find this sort of adoption to ASTM specifications. So what are the issues related with ESA? So if you look at 201, if you don't actually want to test with 1012 and wait 12 months, you can actually look at a prescriptive approach. In other words, you can sort of do a recipe of ingredients and identify what's necessary to meet a certain level of performance. So depending on the severity of the class of exposure, meaning the sort of increasingness of concentrations generally of sulfate, you can either use sulfur resistant cements or sort of a blended system to ideally have performance. So again, this is what 201 considers as what we got you covered, right? And then again, if you look at 318 or 201, there's again this sort of performance-based method in which you either test at 6, 12, 18 months, and as long as you meet a certain expansion criteria, then you can meet performance that way as well. However, again, the length of the test really is a sort of drawback, right? So we really don't want to look at a length of 6 or even 8, especially 18 months in order to do this particular type of test. So we've done a lot of different data over the many years. We've done testing over 15 years on sulfate in both field and lab. And you know, if you look at performance-based specifications and performance cements, right, what you have here is basically a variations of different sulfur resistant cements. And what's interesting is that you have a high sulfur resistance actually performing worse than a moderate sulfur resistance. And so that's sort of, you know, indicating, right, that prescription may not be the best solution. So, you know, we thought that maybe this is not particularly an issue, or maybe this is sort of an anomaly for the results. And so we actually have a outdoor exposure site where we did testing in sort of real conditions, heat, temperature, humidity, right, and moisture, sort of a part of the equation. And so from this sulfate testing site, we've actually collected data over 3 or 4 years now, and we're starting to see similar results where the type 5, which is a high sulfur resistance, is performing worse than a type 1, 2. So again, sometimes just the production of the cement alone, while it indicates a particular chemistry, it may not have, for whatever reason, the actual performance that is required for a sulfate environment, right? And so that's what really draws the need for this type of test. And so again, this method is sort of lengthy and doesn't actually have good data connection with the field. So we have a need for a new test. And so the new test method that we developed in-house is really based on sort of many studies that has been done over the years. And so the idea of sulfate, right, is really based on the idea of a sort of ingression of chemicals that causes chemical reaction. And so the difficult with this is that it's a diffusion-based system. In other words, it takes time for the sort of the reaction to occur, cracks to develop, and then further ingression to occur. And when you think about measuring expansion, right, a lot of times when you get expansion, you may be measuring expansion near the pin, while the actual center of the actual sample may be undetected. In other words, you don't have much deterioration that's really being measured and really giving you sort of a good result of sort of deterioration that may be occurring in the sample, right? So this is what kind of draws to our particular type of method, right? And so what we end up having essentially is a proposed method based on a vacuum impregnation system. So essentially what we've done is vacuum impregnate our samples with sodium sulfate in this particular case. And so we simply dry out the sample in an oven for a period of time, and then we put it into a vacuum system and then introduce that vacuum with sulfate and then allow that to essentially be sucked in, if you will, into the sample, so that you eliminate essentially the diffusion coefficient. So you essentially allow the sample to be completely submerged in sodium sulfate, so that you accelerate the amount of attack or the attack that would happen, particularly because, again, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do essentially is just initiate the chemical reactivity and just how much chemical reactivity could occur with a particular cementitious system, right? So we dry the sample and then we simply just allow the ingression of sulfates within that sample. So it's very important to allow that drying sample to occur in order to actually be able to ingress the actual sulfate solution. So we have here again a system in which we just simply saturate with 5%, which is simply no different than the 12-20 method. Once we saturate, we simply put it into the same container and then allow it to measure expansion. So some quick data here. We have different variations. We have, you know, different types of cements that we looked at, and also two different types of classes of fly ashes, and then we had a ternary system that we also looked at with silica fume. So again, we measured length expansion over time. We also did mass, but specifically I'll just kind of show some length change data. The mixture designs were all based on the same sort of 10-12 methodology, 0.485. The Class C was a 30% replacement, Class F 25, and then the ternary system with a 35, Class C, and a 5% silica fume. Again, this is for both type 1, type 2, and type 3 system. And then the only difference, again, is that we vacuum saturated sample. So we looked at both 10-12 as a control and the vacuum saturation system. These are some quick images of the testing itself. So you can see the tanks that we use, the mortar bars that are placed in there, and sort of the in the system in which the tanks are essentially simply filled with sodium sulfate. Once the tanks are allowed to completely remove all the air, then we simply just allow them to begin draining in the sodium sulfate into the bars. Again, prior to that, we have to dry the samples. So this is interesting data, just showing you what happens essentially when you dry out the samples. This is kind of confirming that on the black, before vacuum saturation, you've eliminated about 5.5%, for instance, of water from the control. And then post vacuum impregnation, you have about 6% or so of moisture gain. In other words, this is what we assume to be the sodium sulfate solution that is being absorbed back into the sample. So it's sort of confirming to us that we are indeed removing moisture, allowing the pore system to be emptied, and then essentially filling those pores back up with the sulfate solution, right? And so when we look at simply just the 10-12 method, right, this is simply just looking at straight 10-12, meaning we haven't vacuum saturated it. And you look at the control, this is a typical curve that you get from sulfate testing, sort of an expansion curve that sort of slowly begins to progress upward. And once you initiate cracking, then you begin to really escalate the cracking. And so when looking at variations in mixes, this is the Class C fly ash. Class C tends to perform much worse, particularly because of the chemistry. And then this is a ternary system, and this is the Class F. Class F typically has a much better performance. And so this is one of the reasons we chose these sort of chemistries, is that it has a variation in terms of performance, right? And so now when you look at the vacuum saturation system, clearly when you have the control in comparison to the 10-12, right, you have a dramatic increase in terms of expansion, right? And dramatic acceleration in terms of the rate of expansion, right? So whereas this didn't pass the expansion limit to about 6 months, we reached that expansion limit to as little as 60 days, or about 8 weeks or so in terms of the vacuum saturation limit. So about 1/3 of the time. When we look at Class C, while the 10-12 was pretty aggressive alone, because Class C is a very poor performer, we still saw some dramatic increase from the vacuum saturation test, right? And so when you look at Class C again, when you get to pretty expansive and pretty aggressive solutions, particularly for Class C, you almost get a complete mush sort of consistency of these bar samples. So it's almost very difficult to even measure these bars after a period of time. When looking at the ternary system, now you see even more dramatic increase again, and then even more in the case of the Class F fly ash. So the Class F fly ash, while it didn't necessarily exceed the expansion limit to about 18 months in this case, sorry, 15 months in this case, for the vacuum saturation method, you had about more or less 6 months in terms of when that exceeded the expansion limit, right? So again, the question is now, how do we determine what that expansion limit should be if we assume this sort of test method being considered as an adoption for a performance method to evaluate sulfur resistance? When we look at type 2 and type 5, we see the same performance. What you see here on the left is the 10-12 method, and what you see on the right is essentially the vacuum impregnation procedure. So we're looking at lowering the C3A content. Obviously, you should see an improvement of sulfur resistance, just simply because you have a lower aluminate content. This is because the aluminates are primarily attacked when you have sulfate exposure. And then type 5, even lower C3A, having a longer time until reaching, in some cases, right, up to 600 days, you still have not actually exceeded the 0.1 expansion according to 201. But when looking at the vacuum impregnation procedure, you have a much dramatic increase. In fact, you have a type 5 that has a 25% fly ash addition, and that about a year is when that fly ash actually exceeded that 0.1 expansion, right? So again, while it's still a fairly lengthy time, much more quicker than what would actually be considered as far as the typical traditional 10-12 method here, 600 days of testing and still not exceeded that expansion. So I kind of wanted to show the sort of deterioration as well. You can see here on the left, the 10-12 method versus the accelerated method. This is after 1 year, you have cracking, obviously breaking of the bar, but after only 4 months, complete deterioration with the type 1 control. So obviously showing the aggressiveness of this test method.
Okay, right. Fred, we need to wrap up in about 2 minutes here.
All right, perfect, no problem. So yeah, that's pretty much what we've done at this point. So we've also have a publication also looking at other types of sulfates. This is calcium, magnesium. You see similar performance, right? This is the control with the dashed line. This is the vacuum impregnation, the solid line. So again, in all cases with the type 1 to type 5, much more faster accelerations of expansion. Same thing with the calcium sulfate in this case. We did some additional investigation to ensure that the type of chemistry or formations of the deterioration was the mode, didn't change the mode of deterioration. So we did confirm that, still showing gypsum in the form of the main sort of deterioration mechanism. And in terms of calcium atronite deposits. And so again, the advantage and disadvantage, you can quickly assess sulfur resistance faster. It's a simple technique that doesn't require much change from the 10-12 method. It's very practical and can quickly screen out mixtures. You know, some of the disadvantage in this case, it still takes some time. Obviously, it still veers away from field condition because we're still using mortar bars. However, we have looked at ways of doing with concrete. When looking at the typical without vacuum impregnation versus with vacuum, we have much faster results. Right? So we have a much faster torpid deterioration. Right? So I'll quickly kind of head into the conclusions in this case. So again, We did see a much faster motor deterioration with the vacuum impregnation method. Right, the visual shows the visual results. I think show the severity of the and the drastic effect of the vacuum impregnation. So I think we have a little bit more work to do in order to really seek sort of adoption within ASTM to use this method. But ideally, at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is develop this method for a concrete mixture rather than a mortar mixture. All right, and I always like to show this because sulfate attack is one of those really difficult types of topics. So with that, I appreciate your time and thanks for your attention. Any questions?